Topic of today is democracy, a noun or a verb? We're going to find the answer to that. And we're also going to be dealing with elections not being scary. And why should they not be scary to us as Christians? Well, the main reason is found in Romans 13. I read this about once a year around election time. And I'm going to move back over. And you will find there that our Heavenly Father, who made the earth, the universe, the billions of stars, also puts in place all of our leaders. We should not forget that. So read Romans 13 as an exercise before you go to vote or when you're watching CNN or MSNBC. Either one. It's a great exercise to remind you that who he puts in place is sometimes to help our spirit grow as much as for the country's sake. So I'll leave that in there. I'm going to circulate all these slides. You can go back through them. If I ran all the videos, it would be over 50 minutes. So no way can I play all the videos, but you can go in and listen to them again if you want to after my presentation. One of the major people that I'm talking about today is Dr. Timothy David Snyder. He's a professor of history at Yale University, world-renowned for Eastern European history. He speaks 5 languages, reads 10 languages, has written numerous books, including 6 on Ukraine and Russia. So he is seen as a worldwide respected historian. If you go, this is a link to Timothy Snyder that you can go into my slide set and click on and immediately go to his website where he talks about the tyranny that's found in many countries. Is it possible that we could become a czar-like anarchy in the US? Look at Germany. It went from a democracy to the Nazi Germany and back again. And that threat is not so far off because here's America in the 1930s. Look at the number of people saluting the swastika as it goes by. Not only that, it was in New York City, and they had a Nazi headquarters that America was thrilled with. They didn't have demonstrations against the Nazis. Nobody thought it was that bad back in the early 30s. In fact, there's towns, a road, a lake, and a mine are named swastika in the United States still. So it's a present danger. Democracy, I would make a point, is not a given. It's not a noun. What is the antonym for democracy? What is the opposite of democracy? How many have lived in an autocracy? Okay, so I'm playing a presentation about autocracy that I help us to recognize symptoms of an autocracy when it begins to develop in the US. Take it away, Ted. Okay. This is a presentation.
I will try to keep my remarks
United
brief.
Nations Security
Floor
Council.
to Mr. Timothy Snyder. You have the floor.
He just introduced Dr. Timothy Snyder. You won't see him right away, but at 1 minute.
Thank you very much.
You will appear.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to be with you. I will try to keep my remarks brief. I speak to you as a historian of the region, a historian of Eastern Europe, and specifically as a historian of
That's not him.
mass killing and political atrocity. I believe that the discussion that we're having today about this word Russophobia can clarify something very important about the character of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and about the character of Russia's illegal occupation of Ukrainian territory. I will limit myself to two main points. My first point is that harm to Russians and harm to Russian culture is primarily a matter of Russian policy. And so that if we're concerned about harm to Russians and Russian culture, we should be concerned about the policies of the Russian state. My second point will be that the term Russophobia, which we are discussing today, has been during this war a form of imperial propaganda, a form of imperial justification for Russian war crimes in Ukraine. So, beginning from the first point, the premise when we discuss Russophobia is that we are concerned about harm to Russians. That is a premise that I certainly share. I share the concern for Russians. I share the concern for Russian culture. Let us think then of the actions this last year, which have caused the most harm to Russians and to Russian culture. I'll briefly name 10. Number one, forcing the most creative and productive Russians to immigrate. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused about 750,000 Russians to leave Russia, including some of the most creative and productive people. This is irreparable harm to Russian culture. Number two, the destruction of independent Russian journalism so that Russians cannot know the world around them. This too is Russian policy and causes irreparable harm to Russian culture. Number three, general censorship and repression of freedom of speech in Russia, in the Russian language. And this is an irony which bears noting. In Ukraine, you can say what you like in either Russian or Ukrainian. In Russia, you cannot. If you stand in Russia with a sign saying no to war, you will be arrested and very likely imprisoned. If you stand in Ukraine with a sign that says no to war, regardless of what language it's in, nothing will happen to you. Russia is a country where there's one language and you can say very little. Ukraine is a country where there are two languages and you can say what you like. When I visit Ukraine, people report to me about Russian war crimes using both languages, using Ukrainian or using Russian as they prefer. Number four, the attack on Russian culture by way of censoring school books, weakening Russian culture at home, the destruction of museums and non-governmental organizations devoted to the memory of Russian history. All of those things are Russian policy. Number five, the perversion of the memory of the Great Fatherland War by fighting a war of aggression in 2014 and 2022, thereby depriving all future generations of Russians of that heritage. That is Russian policy. It's great harm to Russian culture. Number six, the downgrading of Russian culture around the world and the end of what used to be called the Ruski Mir, the Russian world abroad. It used to be the case that there were many people who felt friendly to Russia and the Russian culture in Ukraine. That has been brought to an end by Russian invasion, and that is Russian policy. Number seven, the mass killing of Russian speakers in Ukraine. The Russian war of aggression in Ukraine has killed more speakers of Russian than any other action by far. There's no comparison. And of course, number eight, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to the mass killing of Russian citizens. Some 200,000 are dead or maimed. And this is, of course, simply Russian policy. It's Russian policy to send young Russians to die in a war of aggression. Number 9, this war also means that a generation of young Russians, those who survive, will be involved in war crimes, will be wrapped up in trauma and guilt for the rest of their lives. That is great harm to Russian culture, and that has been achieved, like all of these policies, by the Russian government itself, mostly in the course of the last year. So if we were sincerely concerned about harm to Russians, these are the things that we would think about. But perhaps the worst Russian policy with respect to Russians is the last one, number 10, and that is the sustained training or education of Russians that genocide is normal. We see this in the president of Russia's repeated claims that Ukraine does not exist. We see this in genocidal fantasies on Russian state media. We see this in a year of state television reaching millions, tens of millions of the Russian population every day. We see this when Russian state television presents Ukrainians as pigs. We see this when Russian state television presents Ukrainians as parasites. We see this when Russian state television presents Ukrainians as worms. We see this when Russian state television presents Ukrainians as Satanists or as ghouls. We see this when Russian state television proclaims that Ukrainian children should be drowned. We see this when Russian state television proclaims that Ukrainian houses should be burned with the people inside. We see this when people appear on Russian state television and say, quote, "They should not exist at all. We should execute them by firing squad." We see this when someone appears on Russian state television and says, "We will kill 1 million, we will kill 5 million, we can exterminate all of you," meaning all of the Ukrainians. Now, if we were sincerely concerned about harms to Russians, we would be concerned about what Russian policy is doing to Russians. The claim that Ukrainians are, quote unquote, Russophobes is one more element of Russian hate speech. In Russian state television, those other claims about Ukrainians are intermixed with the claim that Ukrainians are Russophobes. So for example, in the statement where the speaker claimed that all Ukrainians should be exterminated, the reason he gave is that they should all be exterminated because they are Russophobes. This brings me to my second point. The claim that Ukrainians have to be killed because they have a mental illness known as Russophobia is bad for Russians because it educates them in genocide. But of course, such a claim is much worse for Ukrainians. And this is my second point. The term Russophobia is a rhetorical strategy that we know from the history of imperialism. When an empire attacks, the empire claims that it is the victim. The rhetoric that Ukrainians are somehow Russophobes is used by the Russian state to justify a war of aggression. But of course, it's the war of aggression, it's the setting that matters. The invasion itself, the destruction of whole Ukrainian cities, the execution of Ukrainian local leaders, the forced deportation of Ukrainian children, the displacement of about half the Ukrainian population, the destruction of hundreds of hospitals and thousands of schools, deliberate targeting of water and heat supplies during the winter. That is the setting. That is what is actually happening. The term Russophobia is a claim by the imperial power that it is the victim, even as it is carrying out a war of atrocity. This is historically typical behavior. The imperial power dehumanizes the actual victim and claims to be the victim. When the victim opposes being attacked, being murdered, being colonized, the empire says that this is unreasonable, this is an illness, this is a phobia. This claim that the victims are irrational, that they are phobic, that they have a phobia, is meant to distract from the actual experience of the victims in the real world, which is an experience, of course, of aggression and war and atrocity. The term Russophobia is imperial strategy designed to change the subject from an actual war of aggression to the feelings of the aggressors, thereby suppressing the existence and the experience of the people who are most harmed. The imperialist says, we are the only people here. We are the real victims, and our hurt feelings count more than other people's lives. Now, Russia's crimes can be and will be evaluated by Ukrainian law because they take place on Ukrainian territory, and by international law. To the naked eye, we can see that there is a war of aggression, crimes of humanity, and genocide. The use of the word Russophobia, the claim that Ukrainians are ill rather than that they are experiencing an atrocity, is colonial rhetoric, and it's a part of a larger practice of hate speech. That is why this session is important. In Russia's genocidal hate speech, the idea that Ukrainians have a disease called Russophobia is used as an argument to destroy them, along with the arguments that they are vermin, parasites, Satanists, and so on. Claiming to be the victim when you are in fact the aggressor is not part of the defense. It's actually part of the crime. Hate speech directed against Ukrainians is not part of the defense of the Russian Federation. It's part of the crimes that Russian citizens are committing on Ukrainian territory. In this sense, in calling this session, the Russian state has found a new way to confess to war crimes. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Snyder for his briefing.
I could end the talk right there. You know anybody else who's claimed to be a victim recently on trial?
I think we're ready to
We
start.
need to be able to recognize
I'm Marilyn Rusham.
what is a problem within our society. And it's not the person who's claiming to be a victim. So let me put up for you what we as Christians believe. And here's what Jesus said about the devil. He is the father of lies. You can read that and reread it. Hebrews. It is impossible for our Heavenly Father to lie. I've never heard that until recently. So I wanted to give that message to you. It's impossible for our Heavenly Father to lie. But beware, false Christs and false prophets will arise. And we're going to hear about that in 2 videos from now. So, is democracy doomed? Should we go out and vote? Heck yes. Heck yes. And we should look for other ways. Ann Zimmerman and Wayne Zimmerman, they are working the election polls. So, and we have other people. There's another couple who are working the election polls next week and won't be with us. So we need to ourselves say, what can I do? What can I do? So this is Dr. Timothy Snyder again. And it's a long one. It's like 40 minutes. Don't get up and leave me. I'm only going to play the first part of it. You can go into, when I send this around, and watch the whole thing if you want. He talks about how
Historian of Ukraine. So,
okay.
So that helps a bit to define where I'm coming from. So the topic that I've been asked to address is whether democracy is in decline, whether democracy is doomed, and what can we do? I think where I'd like to start is with the question itself, with the word democracy and how we think about the word democracy. What I worry about is when we treat democracy as a noun, as a thing, and ask questions about it. Is it advancing? Is it receding? Is it ascending? Is it declining? we are separating it from ourselves in a way which is unhelpful. Democracy is not really out there in the world as a thing. Democracy, if it exists at all, exists inside us. Democracy has to begin with a desire for the people to rule, which of course is what democracy is all about. So I tend to think that in a way, it's more useful to think of democracy as a verb rather than as a noun. I realize grammatically that's incorrect, but I think you understand the spirit of what I mean. That democracy is something that you do. It's something that when you speak the word, you have to be taking responsibility for it. Because when if you're talking about something that's just out there in the world, something that's a result of larger forces, something that's a result of some constellation of influences that doesn't have to do with you or with the people, then you're not really talking about democracy. Or what's worse, if we talk about democracy as something that's out there in the world, as something that's a result of larger forces, such as, for example, capitalism, I think we're not just making an analytical mistake. I think we're also committing a kind of ethical and political suicide. I think the moment that we say democracy is a result of larger forces, democracy is somehow natural, democracy is a default state of affairs, we're not just making a mistake, we're making ourselves into the kinds of people who aren't going to have a democracy. So to be clear about what I mean, obviously there are some conditions which favor or don't favor democracy. I wouldn't doubt that. Modernity does tend to bring larger scale politics. It makes democracy possible perhaps, but it certainly doesn't bring it. Capitalism is certainly consistent with democracy. There are plenty of capitalist democracies, but there are also plenty of states that are capitalist and are quite tyrannical. So capitalism is consistent with democracy, but it doesn't bring us democracy. And I think in the West, at least, and especially in the English-speaking West, this has been one of the chief mistakes of the last 3 decades, to believe that larger forces in general, or capitalism in particular, are going to bring us democracy. The belief, which was so widespread after the revolutions of 1989 or the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, that there were no alternatives or that history was over. The problem with that, I think we've seen it the last 30 years, is that if you think democracy is being brought to you, then you lose the sense that democracy is a struggle, as it always has to be, as Frederick Douglass said. You lose the muscles and even the muscle memory of what it means to carry out that struggle. And maybe slightly more subtly, but also really importantly, you lose the past and you lose the future. Because if you think that democracy is inevitable, that it's somehow being brought about by larger forces, well, then all those things that happened in the past don't really matter. They just kind of become cocktail party conversation. And if you're sure that there's only one future, a democratic future, then you lose the habit and the ability to talk about multiple possible futures. And you also, along the way, lose the capacity for recognizing other kinds of political systems as they emerge, as they have emerged in the 21st century. And then finally, and this is a little tricky, but I think it's quite crucial, you also lose your ability to process facts. We're in a world where the whole notion of factuality is questioned, and I think this is related to our problem with democracy. If you think that democracy is coming inevitably, if you tell stories about, for example, historical arcs that have to tend in a certain direction, then what you'll tend to do is move the facts so that they fit the narratives. And soon we find ourselves only talking about narratives and not talking about facts, or we find ourselves in countries that claim to be democracies, but no longer have the journalists who are out there producing the facts that we need to have for democracy. So we have what we have. I mean, the answer to the question, is democracy doomed? No. Obviously, we can do things, but is it in decline? Certainly. By any measurable, by any meaningful metric, democracy is in decline in my home country and on average around the world. And we're also in a very specific situation where a non-democracy, Russia, is fighting to destroy a democratic country, Ukraine, which is a sign that things have gone pretty far. Now, the Ukrainians, I would suggest, have given us some indication of what we ought to be doing. What the Ukrainians are doing in resisting this invasion is that they're resisting the larger forces. If we think back to the beginning of the war, everyone assumed that Ukraine would collapse in a few days. That was the wisdom, not only in Moscow, but also in Washington, D.C. In defending the basic idea that you choose your own leaders, the Ukrainians are reminding us that democracy isn't about the larger forces. It often involves ignoring the larger forces, resisting the larger forces, ignoring the people who tell you that it can't be done. And here I think we see a sign of our crisis, which is that many people, at least in my country, and I think more broadly, the reason why they thought that the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, would flee, or the reason they thought that the Ukrainians wouldn't resist, is that they themselves would have fled, and they themselves wouldn't have resisted. That is to say, the idea that democracy is something that you do yourself or for which you take risks had receded so far out of our imagination that we couldn't really imagine that a country would take risks for democracy. Now, of course, I'm citing the example which is close to me. There are many other people around the world taking risks now for freedom, for example, women in Iran. What I'm trying to say is that that ethical point, that democracy is about wanting democracy, is essential. Without that, nothing else matters. Without the ability to think of democracy as a verb, as something that you do, as something for which you'll take risks, nothing else matters. If there's that commitment, if we think of democracy as something for which we take responsibility every time we speak the word, as opposed to something that's just coming to us, then it's like we're doing politics in a different dimension, a fifth dimension of ethics. And once we've done that, we can start to speak about how we would change the larger forces. Once we make that commitment, then we can say some basic things like, for example, we have to also have the fourth dimension of time. We need to have a sense of the future for democracy. We have to care for the earth. We have to care specifically about global warming, because if the future collapses in on us, it becomes impossible to have the kind of reasonable conversation that we need for democracy. We also need the fourth dimension in the sense of the past. We have to have history. We have to be able to reckon with forces like, for example, colonialism, which is so important in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also so important in the history of the United States. If we need the past so that we can reckon with ourselves and self-correct, because self-correction is what democratic decision-making is all about. We also need the first three dimensions, simply being able to move about in the world, in all the senses of moving about that one can imagine. And all of those ways of moving about are hindered by economic inequality. Economic inequality, oligarchy, makes it very hard to have conversations about democracy, the future, or the past. A lot of the space is monopolized by things that are simply ridiculous, but happen because of the way that wealth is distributed. And economic inequality, in a very simple sense, also hinders social mobility, economic advance. Finally, democracy, at least in my country, but not only in my country, has to be understood as a spirit, that is, the way that the laws should be interpreted, the way that the future should arrive, rather than as a matter of legalism. In the Supreme Court of the United States, but not only, this has advanced much further in other countries like Hungary, taking the procedures as being more important than the democracy, more important than the right, is a way of leading the country away from democracy. And in my country, it could lead us all the way away from democracy as soon as the next couple of years. It doesn't have to do so. We can think about these larger structures. We can think in a non-legalistic and in a more ethical way. We can get our minds around this.
Maybe a good place to start is, and it's a sort of a big question, but just how did we get to this place? How did we end up here where we are sort of grappling with?
So that's only a third of his talk. But, you know, I want to get you home by noon. So,
Your presentation?
yes. Okay. So, but you get the gist, don't you? Just sitting here, just sitting at home, yes.
None of the speakers or yourself has defined what democracy is. What do you think democracy is?
The ability of the people to choose their leaders. And I think that's kind of what it is.
Do we live in a democracy?
We have. I think there's many challenges to that democracy. And as he said, democracy is not as certain as it was 20 years ago. So I think we need to feel that, and we need to make decisions that that show us a path forward.
Do you think our founding fathers believed in democracy?
Yes, and I think he'll go into that a little bit later on. But if you look at the way the Constitution was written, all men are created equal. Not not all
Well, that's-
leaders.
Yeah, but that's not democracy as a.
Exactly,
That's
but
not
it's
democracy.
the building blocks, is what I'm saying.
Well, the point I'm getting to is Ben Franklin said, when asked what kind of government do you have? A republic if you can keep it. We have a democratic republic. And the democracy was, to me, was meant to allow everybody to have a voice in their representation of the laws. Laws are made, and they've been democratically made. And under the Constitution, we should follow that. Democracy in its pure form is mob rule. It's just who's ever in the majority that get to do what they do.
I wouldn't say it's mob rule. I would say it's a structured rule. In other words, we have the procedures for how we put our leaders.
Because we have a republic. The republic defines the procedure,
That's
not
very
the,
good.
not
Yeah.
the democracy,
That's very good.
not the mob.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we have a book of order here. We
Mhm.
don't just do what we want. We vote on it, we elect things, but we have a structure.
That's right.
So I'd like to know, I mean, neither of the speakers so far has described what democracy is, either as a noun or as a verb, and how it applies to us.
It's kind of difficult. I'm going to be sending out the whole thing so you can watch his whole talk. I have a couple more views that lend into what democracy is. But David, you had a comment.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what was just said here. Democracy has to be more than the people electing their leaders. There's got to be some principle involved. I mean, Alabama elected George Wallace. Does that mean that everything's fine? Germany elected Hitler. Russia tolerated Stalin and Putin. So democracy is not, it's just a neutral term. It's a way of choosing, but what are we choosing?
Yeah, I mean, you can choose to elect Wallace, or you can choose to elect Hitler, but you have to do that with the knowledge of, are they telling you the truth, and is it the belief system that you support?
That's why the founding fathers set up a constitutional republic to
Yeah.
put barriers in the way of temporary hysteria and mob rule and that sort of thing. There was a process that had to be gone through and give people time to find out what the truth is, and not, World War I, Germans with babies on bayonets and all this stuff we find out 10, 20 years later was just a bunch of bull, can inflame mobs. So pure democracy needs to be tempered with rules and procedures, which the founding fathers are smart enough to come up.
Yep, David.
I recommend people reread Alexis de Tocqueville's book on democracy in America. And I would essentially say that we're a republic with democratic principles. But this is a good discussion.
So give me that name, and I'll include it on the slides, question and answer sheet for everybody here who didn't get the author, so that we can look at it and actually read about it. Especially me, who hardly reads anything since the Golden Books. But anyway, got another one to play for you. You will see her online as S.E. Cupp. She's a CNN political commentator. She's a conservative commentator. She's a Republican, like me. She's written one book, Losing Our Religion, the Liberal Media's Attack on Christianity, which I'm going to read. So, Ted? Okay.
sprinter gene. I wonder if you have it or if that's why you didn't make the team.
Let me pull it up. Sprinter gene.
On this
Don't have
particular
it.
video,
Yep, I
it
knew
has
it.
to go through this
Can't catch,
commercial.
too short. What else does it tell?
Was Jesus woke? I'm S.E. Cup. This is Unfiltered. I'm old enough to remember when the conservative movement was focused primarily on fiscal and social issues, national defense, the debt, the deficit, taxes, limited government, family values. The right had yet to tap into that gold mine that is the so-called culture wars, which has become the main event in modern right-wing politics. It's replaced fiscal, moral, and security concerns. It dominates the right-wing media landscape. And it's made celebrities of countless enterprising outrage peddlers. The right's singular obsession with the culture wars, owning the libs, and wokeism has become its North Star, and the effects have not been good for the country or the Republican Party. Abandoning principles in favor of cheap calorie culture wars helped lead the party to lose the House, the Senate, and the White House in just 4 years. And we have one guy to thank for that, Donald J. Trump. The former president and current presidential candidate ushered divisive culture wars into prominence, all too happy to pit Americans against each other in the name of patriotism, and of course as a way of measuring loyalty to him. After all, it's so much easier to focus on the evils of Mr. Potato Head, the green M&M, kneeling for the national anthem, and drag queen story hour, than it is to say balance the budget, secure our borders, end the opioid crisis, and lower poverty rates. Welp, it seems the right's infatuation with wokeism has not only infected conservatism, but Christianity too. This week, Christianity Today editor Russell Moore spoke to NPR's All Things Considered, and what he had to say was alarming. He said that Christianity in the United States is in crisis, and he blamed it squarely on the tribalism animating conservative circles. He said that multiple pastors had told him that after they'd preach Christian values like turning the other cheek, parishioners would complain that those were liberal talking points. When the pastor would point out that he was literally quoting Jesus Christ, the parishioner would reply, "That doesn't work anymore, that's weak." So Jesus is now too woke for conservative evangelicals. Now, this is lamentable but hardly surprising. As the right makes culture wars their entire personality, things like compassion and empathy have become dirty words. Compassion is now synonymous with wokeism. Empathy and things like social safety nets have become synonymous with socialism. Caring about how punitive policies may hurt people, well, that's for the libs. This is the deleterious effect of Trumpism co-opting conservative politics. Trumpism has infected and corrupted myriad institutions once integral to conservatism. Conservative principles are now whatever Trump decides they should be. Much of conservative journalism has jettisoned journalism in favor of Trump propaganda. Support for law enforcement, the military, the intelligence community, the justice system, separation of powers, even American democracy itself, all subjected to whether or not it helps or hurts Trump. Like everything else he touched, Trump has essentially broken Christianity, like he broke conservatism, to the point where even the Bible is too woke for evangelicals. Trump has trumped Jesus. Because in the cult of Trump, it's not enough just to like him. You have to become him, even if that means abandoning everything you once stood for. That's it for me. See you next week.
Your ancestry is so much more than names and dates.
I kind of sat stunned after I heard her talk. I mean, yeah, I didn't agree with Trump, but the fact that he's turning minds away from Jesus.
But that's pure propaganda.
Yeah, that's no.
I didn't vote for Trump. I will not vote for Trump. But this is propaganda. She's lied about Hillary Clinton. She's lied about Trump.
Wait.
you know, Russian interference, you know,
What's propaganda about parishioners coming up and criticizing the words of Jesus? That's not propaganda. That's people that actually did that.
Well, you have free
On
speech in
both
this country
sides.
if you want to be, you know, political, and Trump was voted in just like every other, you know, so are you denying democracy? This is just an ad hominem attack on the person, not on a policy.
It's reporting.
She's
let me speak, okay? She's reporting on what's happening in society.
She's telling you why it happened though and who's responsible. And that's a stretch too far. People don't coming back to church after COVID because of Donald Trump.
No, not that at all.
The church hasn't been in problem for the last 20 years with decreasing attendance and activity of all religions in the country because of Donald Trump.
No. There's an aspect. Because I've never gone up. Has anybody gone up and criticized what Leah's read from the Bible? Certain
that's
people
not the point.
It is the point.
No, we shouldn't all agree on everything. We don't have, is my faith exactly like your faith? Is their faith exactly the same? Do we believe exactly the same thing? When we read the Bible, do we interpret it exactly the same way? No.
Okay.
Maybe it would behoove us to go back to the very first thing that you had in Romans and read it again.
So essentially what he says there is, I have put all the leaders in place. And for a reason. It's for ourselves to maintain our faith, we have to be exposed to different types of leaders. I think Trump did some good things while he was president. But you know, it's changing. Yes.
The statement you just made a couple minutes ago, God puts our leaders in place. Did he put Hitler in place? Did he put Putin in place?
Yes, he put these people in place. And I'm not sure why. Maybe I'll learn when I get upstairs. Why do concentration camps, and why were the Jews treated like they were? You can have people that criticize. Where is God in this? Robbie.
Decades ago, when I lived in upstate New York, I worked for the Girl Scouts, and there was a young woman in one of the troops that I was responsible for who was living in a very difficult house. And I went to see my pastor and I said to him, why does God let this happen? And he said, Robbie, God is not going to swoop down and fix this. God puts people like you in a place to notice the challenge, and you are in charge of solving the problem. I'm like, great. But I think that I think becomes the fundamental in all this. And I think part of the reason I treasure this class is because we can have civil dialogue with each other and not agree. I also think the baseline of the issue for me personally is curated information. So if I work with a diverse variety of clients, and if I Google something that I don't necessarily happen to agree with, but I want to read about it, you probably had the same experience. All of a sudden, your newsfeed is flooded with stuff that's reinforcing the right answer to the question I asked, which may not even be what I believe to be true. And I think I give us all credit for being discerning people who want to hear a variety of thoughts. But unfortunately, in my opinion, we're in the minority. So I I think we're addressing the problem at the wrong stage. And unless we all accept the responsibility to become fully informed of all sides of an issue, not both, all, we don't have enough information to be informed. I hosted a garden party. I happen to be a Democrat. I hosted a garden party for all the candidates running on the Democrat row office slate this summer. And it's not a fundraiser. I won't do that. It's an open whatever. No, none of my neighbors who are not Democrats attended. If one of them hosted a garden party for all the people running on the Republican side, I would have gone to that. But I think we're in such silos. We've surrendered our right to be well informed. So thank you for letting me rant.
Well, I can tell you that this class exists because my good friends, Paul Larson, David Walter, Linda Pyle, yourself, Robbie, David Harrison, because we are, nobody's going to be taken out and shot after this. We should be happy. And,
Hillary maybe, but
and you guys are informing me. I was nervous about this presentation. I almost took it off the schedule because who am I? I am not a historian. I am not a politician. You know, so it was scary for me to get up here and kind of present a view that I thought we need to have more discussions around. And I think we need more discussions. And Paul or David, you can give a lecture on democracy. I think it's something that is not a given. I think we all agree with that. But it's something that we need to talk about and discuss because our grandkids are going to ask us about it. And he also talks about, Paul Snyder, if you go on, he talks about how to talk to small children about democracy. And so what I've tried to give you here are tools with online media, mixed with the Bible, because I think the Bible is my foundation. And I think that I hope it's been somewhat helpful to you. Yes.
Maybe there's another way to look at Romans 13. You and I have discussed this. Perhaps it isn't God speaking through Paul, but it's really King James and the other monarchs of Europe at the time and the other warlords speaking the words they want, that we must obey them because God has put us in place. Maybe that's not true. And, you know, maybe the Bible is wrong on that because of who wrote it and when it was written.
who interpreted it.
And who interpreted it. That there's evil in the world that God had nothing to do with setting up Stalin and Hitler. And it's up to us to remove them and not accept Romans 13 at face value.
So you're absolutely right. And I can give you one example. The original languages, I think Hebrews and Greek, have up to 13 ways to refer to love. But we only have one word, love. There's brotherly love, there's romantic love, there's spiritual love, filio. So there's many different types. So it could have been that Hebrews 13 got somewhat circled around. It could be exactly right. But it does become our basis. So we're 2 minutes left. I'm going to take editorial license here unless somebody has some closing comments. Next week, we have scheduled a field trip to the 1704 Newland grist mill that is found, you can get there by going down Highway 1 or up to Highway 1 and Cheney Road. It's right there at the corner. And they are extremely well organized. They're going to divide us into 3 groups because there's 3 floors to the grist mill that they want to take you through. So each group will go to a different floor, and you're going to see what was the major factory in the US during our early days of our founding fathers. They also have a museum that you can walk around, and they have a gift shop separate from the grist mill. You will find out when you go how the construction, the widening of 322 in Glen Mills, it's a beautiful road, how it was done all wrong, because it almost shut down Newland grist mill. The silt was not prevented from running off as it should have been. And the silt filled their creeks, filled the grist mill, and they have been in historic restoration of their mill for months. And you'll find out more about that, but that's over a mile away. Actually, the creeks that fill Newland grist mill come from the other side of 322, back of the Pancake House, IHOP. That's where it actually starts running towards the mill. So please come. I'm going to find out, Nancy, if they have elevators in the grist mill, because it would be kind of difficult for you to run up 3 floors of stairs.
Sure.
But I will find that out, and I'll specifically get that to you. But we need to be there no later than 10, because the tour starts at 10. And you just turn onto Cheney Road going south, and there's a huge parking lot, parallel free parking forever and a day. It goes clear over to a original log cabin that I've been to a lecture in. And so it's a wonderful place, wonderful setting. So look forward to seeing everybody there, especially the people from your neighborhood.
Glen Mills.
Glen Mills.
No, in Maris Grove.
In Maris Grove, yeah. But it'll be, you won't find anything built before 1704 around here that's open for a tour. And I will send out maps. Yes,
And
Ann.
if I could just put in a plug, since we're talking about democracy, next Tuesday is election day. I'm gonna be working the polls all day.
Ann, thank you. Yeah.
And the local elections are the really important one. Everybody focuses on the presidential.
No.
But, you know, we're talking about school board, we're talking about judges, we're talking about sheriffs, DAs, the row offices that Robbie talked about. Please get out and vote, whatever your party, or if you're an independent, please get out and vote. This is a poorly attended election, and it's really the most important one. So,
Yes,
hope to
and I
see you
totally
there.
agree. My wife would not go on a vacation to visit our 5th granddaughter in Indianapolis until the day after election. So that's when we leave.